Hello everyone. So today I will talk about GPT-2, GPT-3, and ChatGPT. And also later, if the source of the image is taken directly from the original paper, I will not label it again, but you will be able to find the acknowledgement at the last few slides of this presentation. So here is a quick demo, and you can feel free to try out this API. So basically, here are a few inputs that I tried. So if I ask the model that when will I go to China this year, it can tell me that it don't know any information about my plan. And the second one is a classic brain teaser. So you can see that the model obviously it can do math, but it won't recognize that if we shoot at one bird, then the rest would just fly away. So there won't be any birds left on the tree. Okay, so here is a general timeline of how when these papers came out respectively. So even though today I want to focus on GPT-2, 3, and ChatGPT, I still have to talk a bit about GPT-2 and InstructGPT because these two are the give you about the underlying model architecture. So GPT, when it first come out, it has a size of about 100 million, and it uses the book corpus to train this model. And later, GPT-2 and GPT-3 has increased from to 1.5 billion and even 175 billion. This is a gigantic model. So when you increase the size of the model, of course, you also have to increase the size of the data set. So the author has obviously they try to increase and to get more data of this 45 gigabytes. And later when the model has expanded to this 175 billion, they have to use also a huge data set in order to train this model properly. And even that, they would still say that the model is underfitting. Okay, so let's go to the first paper, GPT. Basically, it proposed the idea of pre-training. So before this paper, most of the models are focusing on specific natural language processing tasks, and they have different architectures crafted specifically for each task. So it is very expensive and time-consuming to obtain these specific data for training. And the goal of the author, as they propose, is to learn a universal representation that can transfer with little adaptation to a wide range of tasks. Later, we will see some more example. So in this paper, the author, they propose to use a generative pre-training method of unlabeled text so that they don't have to, for so much data, they don't have to label it. And this is basically self-supervised learning. And then after they have pre-trained the model, they can fine-tune it on specific tasks to further improve the model performance. So the resource they used for pre-training is the book corpus data set. And there are still several data sets that's manually annotated, used for fine-tuning later. Okay, so there are two stages. One is the pre-training, which I'll explain in this slides, and the other is the fine-tuning process. So I'll just talk about pre-training first. For pre-training, basically it's just what author choose is the language modeling. So given this sentence, which but actually the pre-training corpus is much longer. But let's say this is just one data point that we use to pre-train the model. So we want to train the model to be able to predict the words given its previous words, so that we're actually trying to maximize the probability of students given V, or maximize the probability of opened given V students. So all in all, we're trying to maximize the probability for this full chain of words given its previous words context. And so this can be later simplified as into this equation. And here is the model architecture. So just for introductory level, you can view that this sentence, let's just assume each word is one token. So they use a 768 vector to represent each token, and we will have a 5 times 768 vector here. But actually, it may not be exactly 5 tokens. It really depends on how the model tokenizes this sentence. But let's just assume that it's about this size vector. So this vector will get passed to a mass multi-self attention layer, which can be viewed as here. So we say the token V will pay attention to the token V as well, and the token student will pay attention to V student. To learn more about this, you may need to read the paper, or attention is all you need, but let's just simplify it as this. So each vector embedding will be influenced by the token that it pays attention to. So after the attention layer, they will normalize per layer, and then through the feed-forward layer normalization, and then later it will be passed through specific heads, depending on what task the author are trying to do. So I'll give you more examples later. Then in the fine-tuning stage, so after pre-training, we can obtain a model that have relatively some knowledge about the English language. For instance, what word to put in at after a sequence, so that the full sequence is more fluent. And so after we have obtained this model with pre-training knowledge, we can fine-tune it on a labeled task. So here is an example, and I actually take this text from the movie review. So for instance, the first sentence can be labeled as positive because it describes the movie in a positive point of view. And the second sentence has a negative label. So this is just one example of what the model can do. So we can train the pre-trained model on a full set of a lot of data points of either positive or negative, and later ask the model to predict this label. So here, the fine-tuning, we're trying to, so after the last layer, we are trying to do a softmax. Then we can get the probability on the label Y. So Y here is either positive or negative. And we are trying to fine-tune the parameters of the model such that we can maximize this probability of the model predicting the correct label. So I believe that one major advance in this paper is that unlike previous papers that use different architectures for each task, GPT kind of unites all these tasks with a single model. So here, if you view this transformer as a black box, you can see that for different kind of natural language processing tasks, we can just pass it through this black box model. And after we obtain the linear layer, we can just use it to obtain the final predictions. Or here, just for instance, let's say similarity is a task that you want to know if you are given two sentences, how similar they are. And you may give them a score from 1 to 5. Or classification is a task that we have seen previously. For instance, we want to classify a sentence as positive or negative. And entailment is that if you have two sentences, you want to decide if the second sentence is actually can be derived from the first sentence, which means a yet entailment relationship, or the second sentence doesn't agree with the first sentence, that is a contrast, that is a contrastive relationship, or these two sentences can have no relationship whatsoever, and that is neutral. An example would be, for instance, today is a sunny day, and the second sentence is it rains. So these two are contradictory. So that was not entailment, but contradictory. Yeah, so here I will just quickly show some results analysis. this model. So after pre-training and then fine-tuning, it obtains 9 state-of-the-art performances out of the 12 data sets, which is quite impressive at that time. Okay, so here, because the author, they want to say that pre-training is really useful for the downstream tasks. So this is how they prove it. So the graph on the left, they show that as they take more and more layers from the pre-trained model, the performance on these 2 downstream tasks actually steadily increases. And on the right, they show that as the number of pre-training updates increase, so which means if they pre-train the model for longer, the performance on various tasks also increases. So this is how they prove their point. And now I have covered GPT, and the next step, the author actually talk about zero shot, because unlike the language models that need thousands of demonstrations or even more, humans can directly look at one task and give you an answer. So in this GPT-2 paper, the author wants the language model to have the same sort of task that doesn't require any supervised training, but can directly give the answer. Okay. So they summarize the challenge as the current systems are more like narrow experts, because these models are very brittle and they're very sensitive to data distribution and task specification. So here I put 2 examples taken from different papers. The first one is not a NLP task, but it's for better visualization. So if you can see that on the first column, the model can generally predict the correct category with very high confidence. But if you zoom in the image or rotate it a bit, the model will give all sorts of very wrong answers. And the second part is an NLP task. So the task is that when presented with a paragraph and a question, the model is supposed to look into the paragraph and answer this question. So originally, the model can answer it quite correctly. But if we just add this one sentence at the end of the paragraph, because maybe this is unlike the data distribution the model have seen before, it right away give a wrong answer. So this is what is not desirable at all. And on this work, it also argues that it is very troublesome to manually create and label a training data set for each task. So ideally, without any labels, after we pre-train a language model, it can directly work on this task and give you a response. So this is what the author proposed, is that they suggest that LMs can perform in a zero-shot setting. And they also discovered that the capacity, which is about the size of the language model, is very important to the zero-task performance. And so if we increase the capacity of the model, we can also increase the performance, but only in a log linear fashion. So in this paper, they generally follow the model architecture in the previous GPT paper. And the data resource they use for pre-training is a much larger data set. Yeah, so let's look a little bit into the data set. So the author suggests to look into this data set, Common Crawl, which is a huge data set taken by using web scrapes. However, if you take data directly from the web, like some of the web pages, it may consist of just pictures. If you want to take word from it, it can be like just some timestamp kind of information. So it doesn't really make much sense. And so there is really data quality issues. So to mitigate this problem, the author want to focus on content that to a certain degree human also agree on. So in the end, they only look at outbound links from Reddit. And specifically, they only use the content that receive 3 karma from users. So this means that at least some users think this content is interesting. So this might be useful for the language model. And so in the end, after cleaning, which is I won't go into much detail about it, but they go through like text extraction, deduplication, so on and so forth. And in the end, they obtain about 40 gigabytes of data. And here, I take this picture from the paper because it's quite interesting. You can see that even though mainly the data is based in English, it also has mixed in some of the data in other languages, such as French. Like in this sentence, it says, "I'm not the cleverest man in the world." But like they say in French, "ne suis pas un imbécile." Definitely it suggests that this line of French, it has about the same meaning as this sentence. So the author used this as an example as to how the model might actually learn some of the translation capabilities from from the corpus that contain this kind of information. Okay, so here are some results. Let's look at the language modeling performance. So you can see that as the number of parameters increases, they also actually, they experimented with 4 different sizes of language models with increasing number of parameters. So as the number of parameter increases, you can see that the performance also increase. So this is perplexity, which the lower the value means the better the performance. Like generally it agrees with, if the value is lower, then the language is more fluent and make more sense to humans. So yeah, so this is what they find. And in terms of other specific NLP downstream task, actually I feel this this first graph is the most impressive. The author actually compared the zero-shot performance against some of the supervised systems. And you can see that the largest model, it actually it's about the same performance as this system. So please take note that all these systems, they actually have been trained on supervised data, whereas these models, they haven't really seen the supervised data. And secondly, on translation, you can see that the performance generally exceed the embed nearest neighbor list method, but it's still not as good because, such as using denoising and back translation, the model is still outperformed by this. And if you look at summarization and question answering, you can see that the model's performance is far from ideal. So this line is actually a baseline for just randomly take 3 sentences from the input article as a summary. So yeah, the model, even the largest one, its performance is around this random performance. And in terms of question answering, actually other open domain QA systems, the performance is way up there. So for these 2 data set, these 2 tasks is not so good. Yeah, so for GPT-2, after the authors discovered that their zero-shot performance is not so good, however, by increasing the model capacity, they can obtain better performance. And naturally, the next step is just to increase the model size to even larger. So they actually increase from the maximum of 1.5 billion here to 175 billion in the GPT-3. And they also look at different settings such as few shot, which is definitely less challenging than the zero shot setting, because even for zero shot, like sometimes if you don't provide examples for humans, they may also be confused. But for few shot, we don't require the model to look at a question and give answer right away, but we give the model a few examples to help it learn better. So this is also called in-context learning. I will give more details. Yeah, so in this paper, here is an overview. The author still argues that for pre-trained transformers, because at that time, it is very common to fine-tune on the pre-trained transformer model. So, but to fine-tune this model, you still need task-specific data sets, which is still very troublesome to label, and it also requires a lot of effort and money and time to do that. So in the GPT-3, in this work, the author suggests that we no longer fine-tune the model. However, we let the model do tasks in a few shot learning kind of setting, So please take note that this few shots is different in the setting that you train the model with a few examples. Here, we're no longer talking about training. So all this is done in the inference time. And the author shows that the different performances of zero shot, one shot, and few shot also grows with different model capacity, with increasing model capacities. And the architecture they use is still about the same as GPT-2. Of course, there's a bit of tiny changes here and there, and it's never very easy to train a very large model, but I won't really focus on this today. So the data resource they use for pre-training is a huge data set that they filter on Common Crawl and some other data set that is of smaller size. Okay, so here is what the author mean by in-context learning. So first, they pre-train the model. And during this pre-training stage, the model will probably has already learned all kind of skills. And later, during inference, which is like during prediction, they can give the model a few demonstrations of the task, and they will ask the model to give the answers right away. So these are just different examples of different tasks. So here I'll give more details of the comparison between the zero shot, few shots against the traditional fine-tuning. So in traditional fine-tuning, when we have an example, of course, we'll train the model sometimes using larger batch sizes, but just for illustration only. The author showed that for each example, we'll do a gradient update, which means we'll change the parameter of the model. So after a few iterations of this, the parameters of the model have been updated, and then we'll use the fine-tuned model for prediction. However, in zero shot, we'll just give a task description and the task, and the model will give you the answer. And in one shot, there is one example only, and we don't update the parameters, but after this demonstration, the model is supposed to give the answer. So the same thing for few shot, except that we just have more examples for the model. And here are the details of the training data sets. We can see that this Common Crawl, of course, the author still filtered it because, as explained previously, the data set taken online is really not clean and not of very good quality. So it's quite interesting to see that even though this data set, it has a huge number of tokens, actually to train for the full model, it actually just train it for 0.44 epochs, but for the other data set, they train it for more epochs. And the author, they noted that the model is actually a bit overfit on the other data set. However, even though it overfit on this data set, mixing these high quality data set with Common Crawl can help a lot to improve the language model's performance. So in general, by using this method, they still gain by help to improve the model, and at the same time, they can benefit from the huge amount of data from this online source. So here is a overview of more detailed parameters for the model. And you can see that they increase the layer, and also they increase the dimension of the model. So you can also observe that if you want to train larger models, a much larger batch size is used. However, the learning rate decreases. So here is the aggregate performance. So all these fainter color lines, they actually represent one task. And these solid color lines is a aggregation of the task. And this is the few shot performance. So generally, you can see that the few shot performance is better than one shot and better than zero shot. And as the capacity of the model increases, the performance will also increase. Okay, so here are the results on the language modeling related task. So if you can remember previously, the 1.5 billion GPT-2 model, it actually has a worse performance than this, and now this has become really impressive. Okay, so here is one task, closed book QA. This is actually used to evaluate how much factual information is stored in this model. So here are some examples of the sorts of questions. So such as which politician won Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 and what fragrance essential oil is obtained from damask rose. These kind of questions, it is quite challenging for me even. So, but we can see that the future performance, the model can even outperform fine-tuned SOTA models. So it really suggests that with this very huge model size, it can really remember the factual information. Yes, so with this huge size, it actually has the capacity to store so much knowledge inside. And this task, translation, due to time limits, I won't be able to go through all the tasks. So I just take something I think that is interesting and present it during this presentation. So here, these solid lines, they are translation from other languages to English. And these dashed lines are from English to other. So basically, to translate to English is much better. I think this is also because that 90% of the data set actually come from English. However, it is very impressive because there's only about, I guess, 7% of the data from other languages. And like if you split it into specific language, it will be even lower. However, I think it is precisely that the language model has learned because its language modeling capability, it has learned it, like how to write fluent English. So even if you give it French, it can still write reasonably. That isn't, I'm not saying that it's good as compared to human performance, but definitely it is a very impressive performance. So here, I copy the results, and you can see that with few shots in GPT-3, the performance actually has exceeded supervised SOTA. And this is another task. So here, this PIQA is actually some physics question, and they think is possibly contaminated. So these results may be a over exaggeration. However, let's look at the ARC data. These are actually multiple choice science exam questions, and you can see that actually GPT-3 is really not good. That for this challenge set of questions, it's kind of fail, like it won't pass this exam. And in open book QA, the performance is still not there. And I guess this will be also interesting. So the authors have done some SAT analogies. So in case you haven't taken this exam before, here is just an example. For instance, audacious to boldness as, so you're supposed to find a pair that has the similar relationship as this word pair. So this is actually quite challenging. I mean, it's quite challenging for me and not because I'm not a native English speaker. So here you can see that the largest model, its future performance is about 65%. And according to the authors, this is actually better than the average performance already, the average human performance, I mean. And here is the news article generation. So when GPT first come out, I guess it become very popular because someone has used this model to generate blog posts, and readers are not aware that this is not human written. So we also have presented the results that if you use GPT-3, this larger size model to generate news and ask human to look at, for instance, two news articles, one generated by this model, another written by human, and ask the reader which one is generated by the language model, the human will actually only have about 52% of accuracy to identify it correctly. That means 50% is just chance level. So this means it's very challenging for human to identify whether the article is written by GPT-3 or by an actual human being. So this really shows that this GPT-3 has very good language generation capabilities. And here is also one task that I find very interesting. So you give a definition for a makeup word. So this word, it's definitely not proper English. You just make it up and tell the model what it means, and and ask the model to make a sentence with this word. You can see actually the model can make a really good sentence. So such as fadoodle means to jump down really fast. And the model says that my little sister got really excited and started doing all these crazy fadoodles. It kind of makes sense, I would say. So it's kind of interesting because these kind of words is definitely not what the model has learned from the pre-training corpus. And it's actually learned from this context, right? So it gains information from this context and use it right away to answer the question. So this in-context learning capability is really impressive. However, this model also has limitations. The author have also explained that their architecture is not bidirectional, which means so in the model, when you do self-attention for these kind of tokens, it can only attend to tokens before it, but not attend tokens after it. And so in the pre-training objective, they also weighs every token equally. But however, we know that in human language, some words are more important than others, such as, so if I'm talking to you right now, if I use this kind of linking words, it's definitely not important and doesn't carry much information. But however, I guess for the next words, when the author they use instruction to tune the model, which I'll talk about in more details, they kind of mitigate this limitation, because when they use human instruction and to give a reward to tell like whether the generation is good or not, they kind of put human value of what is more important into this model. Okay, so the next limitation is that a large pre-trained language model, they lack a large amount of word context. So they don't really know real world physics. They haven't been trained on video, so we cannot expect them to have this knowledge on video or audio, etc. This is quite understandable. And poor sample efficiency during pre-training, you need much more text than human do. But this is very common for all sorts of language models. And they also say it's expensive and inconvenient. Yes, for a model of this huge scale, it is definitely very expensive to train, and not everyone can just train it. And decisions are not easily interpretable. The interpretable it has always been a topic of research. So currently, I think this is just a common issue with deep learning. So broader impacts of GPT-3. So we also discussed there's potential misuse of applications. So of course, generally for humans, if we participate in these sorts of illegal activities, we need to write text and prepare for all this. Of course, not to say that this is definitely like we shouldn't do this, but I'm just using an example that if people want to do this, and if now they have a language model that is capable of generating text that is so human-like that people cannot tell that it's generated by a language model, then definitely it will lower the barrier for people to participate in these sorts of activities. So yes, so it's a high potential that they can misuse the model for bad things. And on the other hand, the model, if it's so strong and we use it in real life applications, there can be problems about fairness, bias, and representation. So for instance, there can be stereotypical content or bias in terms of gender, race, or religion. And these will cause issues if you are not careful enough. So here is an example of what I mean by bias. The author, they have analyzed the model and generally ask the model to give the sentiment score. They have consolidated into sentiment score across different races. You can see that the best race, in terms of the model's belief that the model has the best sentiment towards Asians and give them a very high score, a much higher score than the Black. And this is really unfair, and it just shows how significant the bias actually exists in this GPT-3. Okay, so let's recap about how GPT-3 obtained its capability. So I actually read from this blog post. So if you're interested, you can also read in more details. So the summarization is that the language generation ability actually comes from the language modeling training objective. And the word knowledge comes from the training corpora. So if you still remember, previously we've shown the closed book question answering, and the model can actually remember such factual knowledge. So it's definitely from the training corpora. And as in terms of the in-context learning, the author of this blog post is also not sure, but it's likely that this capability comes from the data points ordered sequentially in the same batch during pre-training, but there's still little study on this. So how strong is GPT-3? We have seen that GPT-3 is capable of doing some tasks reasonably. However, it still underperforms the fully supervised models on many tasks. So it may be said that the model might be superficially weak. However, as you will see later in my presentations in the later sections, that these abilities, the model has actually already learned these abilities during pre-training, and it serves as a very important foundations that later will be unlocked by training on code, instruction tuning, reinforcement learning with human feedback. Okay, so here is a screenshot taken from the ChatGPT blog, OpenAI blog, because it's very popular recently. So let's look a bit into the details. So here the user asks, how do you break into someone's house? And the model knows that it is not legal to do so and tells the reader that it's not appropriate to discuss so. However, if the user just says, I'm wondering how to protect my home from burglary, then the model is able to provide a list of suggestions. So this use case just demonstrates that the model will not be so easy to be used for all these bad activities, but can still be helpful for the user. And the second use case, the user wants the model to write a introduction letter to the neighbor. And based on this, the user wants the model to make it more formal. So you can see that the model will be aware of their conversational history and responds to the user's request. However, when the user asks the model to send it for him, the model knows that it doesn't have the capability to send this letter and tells the user that it cannot do so. So in both use cases, we can see that the ideal use case of ChatGPT is actually very powerful and can be very useful for our daily life. However, the ChatGPT, this currently is still no technical paper, and according to the blog post, it uses the same methods as InstructGPT. So just for technical purpose, let's just look a bit into the InstructGPT paper to understand how it works. So from GPT-3 to InstructGPT, is that GPT-3, the author discussed that the model can be very capable with huge capacity and pre-training and combined with few shot kind of setting, but it may not correspond very well to human requests. So this InstructGPT is what the author trying to do. So if few shot is not so effective, they can still fine-tune the model, but they fine-tune the model on a very specific set of data set that help the model to be very helpful. Okay, so here is the overview. So the author discussed that the language model will be misaligned with the user. So what misaligned means is that the model will generate non-factual, toxic, or not being helpful at all. Oh, well, so just a side note that people actually try to use GPT to generate like what kind of references or like what kind of other people's work they can follow, and they discover that GPT-3 just gives them a list of makeup literature, which is definitely not helpful. Okay, so back to this work, the author, they are fine-tuning the GPT-3 with human feedback, and specifically they use reinforcement learning to do so. So they propose three criteria: helpful, honest, and harmless. And they specifically focus on this helpfulness criteria. However, it's also quite understandable because helpful it's sometimes contradictory as harmless, because if people want to use the model to do illegal activities, and then we must take a stand that if we want the model to be helpful, then the model will be harmful, not harmless. So yeah, so in this paper, during training, I think if I remember correctly, the authors still prioritize these helpful criteria. And for data resources, we can see that this time the data resource is much smaller, unlike the 570 gigabytes used to pre-train the GPT-3. So the dataset used for fine-tuning is really a tiny fraction as compared to the pre-training corpus. So there are basically three kind of stages. Let's look at them one by one. So the first stage, this stage, you can view it as just a simple fine-tuning process, just as you fine-tune the model on any other task. So I'll give a zoom-in view of the task. So in the instruct GPT, they use the data according to different use cases. So for instance, if in terms of the use case of brainstorming, the fine-tuning data can be list 5 ideas of how to regain enthusiasm for my career, and then the response they haven't listed here. The response will be also some human written text that corresponds to this prompt. And for generation can be write a short story, and the annotators will also write a story to respond to these prompts, and these kind of pairs will be used to train the model. So after the fine-tuning, the model will already have certain capability to respond to these sort of prompts. And you can see that the prompts, the data set has covered a wide range of use cases. So the next one, okay, let me just do these two in general. So in reinforcement learning, generally what you want to do is that you want to give the model a prompt. The model will produce a output, and then based on the output, you will have another model to give a score of this output. And based on the score, you can update the parameters of the base model. And then it's a iterative process, and by maybe like thousands, or I don't know, even much more kind of iterations, then finally your model will be fine-tuned or finish fine-tuning. So step 2 is that because we need a reward model, so step 2 shows how we train this reward model. So how they do this is that for each prompt, there can be multiple responses. So it's not that short. Like actually, it has a lot of contents after these ... And the annotators will come in and rank these kind of responses. So for instance, they believe that this one, people went to the moon, is the most appropriate answer, better than C. And C is better than A, and A is about the same appropriateness as B, so they rank it and provide this kind of answer to the reward model. So after they have trained the reward model, they can use the reward model and the base model to iteratively fine-tune it with reinforcement learning. Okay, so here are some more details about the data. The labelers, so the prompts, there are two sources of where it comes from. The first source is that it can be written by labelers, which is either user-based or like a plan kind of setting or few-shot setting. And another source is from the OpenAI's API, because they have opened the API for testing. And in the beta version, like a lot of users can write prompts in there. So they also, this is another source or other venue that they collect the prompts from. So there are actually 3 data sets. So for the first one, if you still remember, they directly fine-tune the GPT-3 model. So this fine-tuning, they use the data with a label that the labelers write the demonstration, which is the response to prompts. So this is relatively very high quality data. And for the reward model, they actually don't require the human to give exact mark, but they just require human to rank the outputs. So yeah, so the reward model will know like which answer is better, and in the end, they want this reward model to give a score of the output. And the last data, you need to distinguish that the last data sets, it consists of prompts only. It doesn't have the response. This is because in reinforcement learning, we provide a prompt to the model, and the output will be generated by the model. And so based on the output, we can obtain the score from the reward model and then update the parameters. So only prompts is needed from the last data set. I guess this is also why the last data set can be larger. So because it requires much less effort to write the demonstrations. So here I will show like how the reward model is trained. The reward model is 6 billion in size. It's also taken from the GPT-3 model, but it's just a separate model, and they take out the last few layers and make it to predict a scalar reward instead. So how they train the reward model is that, so let's look here. We take the data from the prompt and demonstration data. So X is the prompt, and YW and YL are 2 outputs, and YW is better than YL. So here we can use the reward model. So even though it hasn't been trained yet, we can still use the model to give a scalar prediction, and for both outputs given the same prompts. And the rationale is that if YW is better than YL, then we want the reward for the better output to be much larger than the reward for the not so good kind of output. And here the author, they actually, because we know that this K value is the number of response to the prompt. So for instance, for this prompt, we have 4 possible outputs. So K equals to 4. So for all these outputs, we will compare them, compare every possible pair. So we'll compare AB, we'll compare AC, so on and so forth. So let's say if K equals to 4, then there can be like 4 times 3 divided by 2, which is 6 possible pairs of YW and YL. So after they have calculate this, they will consolidate and they calculate the average as a loss. So here is also some sort of optimization as explained by the author, because usually the reward model, when you calculate the reward, it will take some time. If you like use a pair of data sets as a single training sample, instead of grouping all the case samples together, so you have to calculate reward for every output. So if we're calculating 6 pairs, then we're calculating 12 reward model. However, if you do it this way, then the reward model can just calculate the reward for the 4 possible responses and store it somewhere. So this will be also faster. Okay, so next, I will talk about reinforcement learning used in InstructGPT. So just in case you're a bit confused, I summarize it in 3 simple steps. So in reinforcement learning, the first thing is that you present a prompt and the model will give you a response. So after you obtain the response from the base model that you want to tune, you'll give the response to the reward model. So this reward model, you can freeze it for now. You can think of it as a fixed model for now. So it will take in the response and give you a reward. So after obtaining the reward, you can update the parameter according to this kind of loss function. However, if we have more and more data, of course, we can also continuously update this reward model to make it better. So if you have a better model trained with reinforcement learning, you can use this model to produce more outputs for different prompts. And then you can also ask the human to again label these, rank these different prompts. So you will have more data for the reward model. And then you'll have better rewards. Then you can even like train the model for even better performance. So this is like really a very iterative process. So let's look a little bit into details of this equation. So there are basically 3 parts. The first part is very simple. So you calculate the reward. However, InstructGPT is trained using proximal policy optimization. So here, proximal means that we don't want the model to deviate too much from the fine-tuned model. So this pi theta is actually, you can see it as the distribution of the reinforcement learning model. And it's initialized with the fine-tuned model, pi SFT. So in this equation, this model is used as a fixed model. So so these 2 models are 2 separate instances. However, you initialize this with the same parameter as this model. So as you train this model to make it more helpful to humans, you don't want its parameter distribution to deviate too much from this. So you can see this second term is actually a KL divergence term. You are calculating the probability distribution of the model that you're training over a fixed model which is the fine-tuned model, and then you're taking a expectation. So this value, if you want to minimize the loss, you're actually trying to force these 2 models to be close to each other. And the last term, you also please take note that the data is actually taken from the pre-training corpus, is no longer the prompt and demonstration corpus. So the author used the pre-training corpus and used the language modeling objective to also train the model. So the intuition is that you still want the model to obtain its generally language modeling capabilities here. So later, the author will also show more results that what happens if we don't include this term. And you can see that this term is actually beneficial. So they have 2 names of the model. The first one, PPO, is the one of only this term. And the PPO PTX is when they fine-tune the model with the pre-training objective as well. So it's this full function. So on InstructGPT, here are the evaluation. The authors basically use human preference on the model So they ask humans to rate which model is better as compared against a, I think it's a fine-tuned GPT-3. And they also use two types of data sets. One type is that the one that evaluates model safety, the other evaluates model performance. So you can see that these two, the PPO and PPO PTX, generally have the best performances. But in terms of toxicity, it's not that obvious, but they still have a somewhat better performance as compared to the original GPT-3 model. As in this is the one that's without further fine-tuning. However, the author also noted that even though that when they prompt the model to be less toxic, the model can be, after fine-tuning, the model can be less toxic because they train the model to be helpful to the user. So if they specifically want to ask the model to be toxic, then the model can be really toxic. So for instance, if you ask the model, how can I steal from a grocery store without getting caught? And the model, without fine-tuning, actually they cannot understand this instruction. But this instruct GPT, it really gives you all sorts of details, like just some general tips and strategies that you can employ to increase your chance of success, and so on, blah, blah, blah. So this is really not ideal. And okay, so here is actually a section that the author discussed why adding the pre-training into the objective function is useful. So you can see that this PPO-PTX, as contrasted to this PPO, in certain tasks, you can see that this PPO, the performance actually drops or that it's not that good. But if you add in the pre-training into the objective, it can still steadily increase. So this is also what the author calls alignment tax, that when you try to align a model to be more helpful with humans, then there's some sort of distribution shifts. And so on these specific downstream tasks, the model does not perform so well. But if you include the pre-training objective, the performance drop is not that significant. So the author also shows that the InstructGPT, they still make mistakes. So I find it kind of funny. So the prompt here is that it asks, why is it important to eat socks after meditating? So this question is asking by assuming that people eat socks after meditating, but actually this is not true. And however, InstructGPT is really fooled by this. It tries to answer this question by saying that there are many theories and ideas. We know that this is completely untrue. And the second one, what happens if you fire a cannonball directly at a pumpkin at high speeds? So of course, anyone can just answer that if you do so, the pumpkin will just explode. The InstructGPT is becoming overly cautious. It says that there are many factors, and some include size, weight, density of the cannonball, the material. So it's really, I think it's really talking rubbish here. So what is going on is probably that the InstructGPT during pre-training, it doesn't have these sorts of knowledge. But however, because the fine-tuning data, human has like when we fine-tune it, the demonstrations maybe has shown the model that you have to answer it in a very cautious way. That's why it's really end up in this sort of manner. So yeah, here are some discussions. The author says that the cost of increasing the model alignment is modest relative to pre-training. Yes, definitely, because they need much less data as compared to pre-training, and of course much less resource for that. And there's also some evidence I didn't really present today, but in the original paper, you can see that the model can also follow non-English prompts, and it can also like answer some code-related tasks. And yeah, so the author, by including the pre-training objective, they can also mitigate the performance degradation, which is the alignment tax, by fine-tuning. And but however, even though they say that they want to align the model to be helpful to humans, it's still really heavily dependent on the 40 contractors, because all this data mostly is generated by these contractors. I think the contractors come in really useful doing annotation about the preferences for the reward model. So whether one answer is better than the other is really determined by these annotators and not by us. So even though we may disagree with the annotators, the model is trained this way because it is trained by the reward model, and the reward model just follows these annotators' preference. So that is why it is really dependent on this. So this suggests that if we, in the future, if we want to fine-tune a model for a specific task, we have to really be aware of who are our audiences and what the model is trying to do specifically. And of course, the model is not fully aligned, nor fully safe. Yeah, fully alignment or safe is really just, I guess, for now, is just really ideal. But author does show that the model definitely that it's more aligned and slightly more safe, I would say, than the previous ones. Yeah, and training a model to be harmless despite user instruction is difficult. Just because if you want the model to be helpful, it may be harmful at the same time if you use the model for the wrong purposes. And yeah, so it's the same thing that making language models better at following intentions make them easier to misuse. So yeah, so I have covered from GPT-3 and the underlying architecture of InstructGPT, which is also the architecture, basically the method used to train ChatGPT. So here, this blog post actually try to trace what happens from what has evolved from GPT-3 to ChatGPT, and I just want to shortly talk about it. So this part, so till here it's GPT-3 series, and next is the GPT 3.5 series. So from the initial GPT, they have trained it on code, and this part I haven't really touched on it, but by using code data to further train this GPT-3, they obtain the codex initial. And of course, on the other hand, if we just fine tune with prompts and so on, they can obtain the instruct GPT. Here is the fine-tuned version because they still haven't used the reinforcement learning yet. And so later, it is believed that this model is actually obtained by first language modeling and both code training and then instruct tuning. And also, this kind of evolution is not 100% validated, but the author actually feel that it's most likely this way. So this is the codex, which has demonstrated very strong capability of chain of thoughts. So I would just like to show you a quick example of chain of thoughts. So let's say we ask the model this sort of question. So this is also in context learning, that we give the model a demonstration of question and answer and ask it another question. However, the model is not capable of answering it correctly. But if we are in a demonstration, we show the model to do this question step by step. Then in the answering, the model would also try to answer it step by step. And in the end, it just magically get the correct answer. So this is chain of thought, that if you ask the model to output a chain of thought, then it can have much better achievements. So this model, it have very much stronger chain of thought capability as compared to the previous ones. And then later, we have this on one spectrum, we have instruct GPT, which uses the reinforcement learning to further train on this, and the other spectrum, ChatGPT, for the dialogue usage. Yeah, so here is also the summary is also taken from the same blog. It summarizes the ability of the model, the OpenAI model, the training method, the API, and also some approximate. So you can see that the Instruct GPT, besides following human instruction, it can also generalize to unseen tasks. And this like a free launch kind of thing. And actually the T0 paper and Flam paper also discovered this kind of trend. And it is believed that as with a huge language model and a variety of prompts, the model can learn to generalize to answer to other sorts of prompts that it hadn't seen before. And the GPT 3.5 series, you can see that the codex, it has code capabilities, and there's also this complex reasoning and channel thoughts capability. So for now, there is like no 100% sure validation, but it is believed that it's very likely that this channel thought capability is actually learned from the training of code data, because in code, there can be very long distance dependencies, and the variable like you defined earlier and use it much later, and there is very strong kind of logic in there. So it is possible that the model has learned the capability from there. And for the Instruct GPT, people have felt that there is a trade-off the capability of in-context learning for zero-shot generation. And for ChatGPT, there is a trade-off for dialogue history modeling. Okay, so this is the last slide on summarization of the capabilities for GPT series. So the language generation ability and basic word knowledge, as well as the in-context learning capability, are from pre-training. Okay, it should be a next bullet point. The ability to store a large amount of knowledge is from the scale of the model. So given a huge model, it can store this sort of knowledge. And yeah, so if you're interested, you can also look at, there's some research papers that investigate that how much knowledge is stored in the model. They try to like diagnose the model and even try to use the model as the knowledge base. Is quite interesting. So the ability to follow instructions and generalize into new tasks from scaling of instruction tuning. This I would feel like this is the most amazing capability gained, because later you can just use natural language to instruct a model, unlike previous models that may not generalize very well to different instructions. So this really brings us one step closer to the real life application scenarios. Next, the ability to perform complex reasoning is likely to be from training on code. Yeah, so it's not solid, but it's likely. And the ability to generate neutral, objective, safe, informative answers from alignment with human, because humans have ranked the answer as before as their preference, and also given the prompt, the annotators are also instructed to write safe kind of responses. So the model will, after being fine-tuned on this sort of data, the model will also give like kind of safe response. And the dialogue ability, like ChatGPT, is also from the reinforcement learning with human feedback, but it's a trade-off. It's believed to be a trade-off for like with, because it's discovered that the ChatGPT have weaker in context learning. I mean, this is just based on like other people's experience by experimenting, by just playing with this ChatGPT model. Like I haven't really personally tried to investigate this. Like this is a trade-off with the modeling dialogue history, increase informativeness, and also rejecting questions outside the model's knowledge scope. Okay, so thank you for your time. And here I included in the 4 papers that I discussed in this presentation. And this is the blog post that I also included in this presentation. And these 2 are very interesting YouTube presentations. If you would like to like look into more details of model.